America in World War II, from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima, the United States in World War II. Written by the History Journals and Liam Dale. Narrated by Liam Dale. In the early hours of the first day of September 1939, the German army, led by the fascist dictator Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. It was the beginning of a global conflict that would prove to be one of the most devastating losses of human life this world has known. The previous World War, sometimes labelled rather ironically the Great War, had been a bloody and horrific conflict that mainly consisted of trench warfare, leading to the loss of thousands of young men's lives. It raged through Europe until it came to a climax in 1918 with a total surrender. Germany, the defeated nation, built up a growing resentment towards the rest of the world due to the financial repayments and loss of territory imposed upon the country by the Treaty of Versailles. In addition, Italy, who had fought against Germany in this war to end all wars, as it was christened, believed that the cost of fighting had done nothing to gain them any territory, and so became compassionate to Germany's fate. Japan, yet another victor, became incensed and restless because it was unable to gain control of neighbouring China. This catalyst of events, due mainly to a policy of appeasement by the United Kingdom and France, who were in continual disagreement about nearly every post-war policy, can now be viewed as unintentionally sowing the seeds of the Second World War. America's involvement in World War I came late in the conflict. Up until then, they'd adopted the diplomatic policy of isolationism, which allowed them strict neutrality in world events and a fair avoidance of siding with one or another country in order to protect the citizens of their homeland. However, this was to drastically change when a telegram was intercepted from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. In it were details of a plan to allow Mexico and Japan to join with Germany in an attack on America in order to gain more control over the outcome of the war. Unexplained attacks by German submarines on U.S. Army ships in the Pacific and around the United Kingdom hastened the declaration of war by America, and directly because of the increased men and firepower supplied by this enraged and noble nation, the outcome of World War I swung in their favour. Once the war was over, the American nation returned to their policy of isolationism due to the failure of any of their European allies to repay to the American government the huge debts they'd amassed. America, as a proud nation, slumbered quietly as Adolf Hitler rose to power through a nationalistic need for a strong leader in a time of Great Depression. She slept on as Benito Mussolini became Italy's fascist dictator and formed an alliance with Hitler during the Spanish Civil War. But America's dreams were disturbed by the Japanese advancement into China to try and gain more control over urban and industrial sites. She awoke briefly to declare a halt on trading with Japan if the Japanese tried to take Southeast Asia and the East Indies from European control in order to advance their economy and natural resources. America, as a free nation, did not sleep easy during the early years of the Second World War. This conflict took place over 4 different theatres, so called because, like a theatre, this was the stage where the battles took place. The main 2 were the European theatre of war and the Pacific theatre of war. Each had its own theatre of operations. This term was defined in the American field manuals as the land and sea areas to be invaded or defended, including areas necessary for administrative activities incident to the military operations. In accordance with the experience of World War I, It was usually conceived of a large land mass over which continuous operations would take place, and was divided into two chief areas: the combat zone, or the area of active fighting, and the communication zone, or area required for administration of the theatre. As the armies advanced, both these zones and the areas into which they were divided would shift forward to new geographic areas of control. During America's initial slumber, the British Prime Minister of the time, Neville Chamberlain, yearned for peace at any cost. He had been a witness to the horrors of World War I, where young soldiers had died in makeshift trenches and in the bloody battlefields. He had seen the aftermath when the soldiers returned home, many of them never to be the same again due to shell shock or the after effects of the infamous gas attacks. America had been a witness to this too, joining the war to help aid victory over the Germans, and watched and waited whilst protecting her own. Neville Chamberlain had met with Adolf Hitler in Germany and brought home a copy of the Munich Pact, signed by himself and Adolf Hitler, which he thought would bring peace. On his arrival, he said to the waiting crowds, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honour. I believe it is peace for our time." However, when Adolf Hitler's Germany broke this pact of peace in 1939, Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement looked out of place. He resigned as leader, and Winston Churchill was hastily appointed in 1940. Churchill would establish a very close friendship with America's President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it was this friendship and respect that would allow the Allied forces to overcome the threat posed to the world by the Nazi invaders. America heard reports of Britain's miraculous retreat from Dunkirk, when troops had been cut off by German soldiers during the invasion of France, but were carried away to safety by thousands of domestic vessels in the space of 10 days. The fall of France was swift, and America was shocked by the ease in which the French surrendered to Hitler and Germany, leaving Britain to fight on alone against the evil dictator. There were also tales of the Battle of Britain, a war fought totally in the skies, where British Spitfires repelled the German Luftwaffe in order to keep English shores safe from imminent invasion. America supplied help in the best way she knew how. By adopting a Lend-Lease policy in 1941 to the countries that it considered her allies, America acted as an arsenal of democracy to these nations, supplying them with all kinds of military equipment and armaments, in the hope that this contribution would allow the war to end sooner without any involvement of American troops. All in all, she leased $1 billion worth to the United Kingdom. It was America's way of saying, "We may not stand up and be counted yet, but there is no doubt that we are behind you 100%. America, still attempting to appear restful and sleepy to the world that surrounded her, was jolted awake by the screams of her children when an unprovoked attack by the Japanese destroyed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese had signed a neutrality treaty with the USSR, today known simply as Russia, to allow them freedom from looking over their shoulder if they continued to try and advance into Southeast Asia. However, the German army had launched Operation Barbarossa, a mammoth plan to invade the USSR with 3 million troops and take control of Moscow within 6 months. Even though Germany had also signed a peaceful agreement with the USSR, Hitler saw no reason why he shouldn't break it. His swift rise to power through Western Europe boosted his ego, and he believed that his mighty German army could easily overcome the Soviets' Red One. Joseph Stalin, Premier of the USSR, had been at the forefront of a great purging of his country's population, much like Hitler would try and do with the so-called ethnic cleansing of Germany through the execution of thousands of Jews, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, pacifists, and the disabled. Stalin, whilst trying to eliminate what he felt were disruptive elements to his Communist Party, severely weakened his once powerful Red Army by removing 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 Red Army generals, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 Red Army Corps generals, 154 out of 186 division generals, 16 of 16 Red Army commissars, and 25 of 28 Red Army Corps commissars. This prompted Hitler's personal orders and plans to attack and overpower the USSR. Japan felt reassured that there would be no invasion imminent from behind them and welcomed the Germans' invasion of the USSR, thinking, much like Hitler, that a victory was a foregone conclusion. In assuming this, and with increasing embargoes placed on trade by America, Japan saw only one option. They wanted to neutralize American resistance to their aggressive advancement in the Pacific Ocean. To do this, they needed to cripple the American Navy, and so they launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which housed the majority of the naval threat to them. On Sunday, 7th of December 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched the fleet's planes in an all-out attack on the American military bases in and around Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a swift and brutal assault, led originally by a few midget submarines that sneakily arrived early to cause disruption. The resulting damage and loss of life was horrific. Nearly half of the American soldiers who died that day were aboard the USS Arizona, which, according to eyewitnesses, shot up out of the water with the force of the explosion and then split in two. Over 1,000 Americans were aboard the stricken ship when it exploded, and the hull became, and still remains, a memorial to those who perished on that fateful morning. Because the American personnel were totally unprepared for attack, this didn't mean they didn't fight back. Stories of bravery and courage under fire have emerged over the years from that day, none more so remembered than the actions of Doris Miller, an African-American who took control of an unattended machine gun and defended the base against the attacking Japanese aircraft. For his valiant efforts in the face of such insurmountable odds, he was awarded the high honor of a Navy Cross. The violent actions of the Japanese shocked America and galvanized public opinion. Whereas before there had been genuine divisions between those who wanted to enter the war to aid their allies and those who wanted strict neutrality with friendly and financial help, now there was an overwhelming national pride at stake. The turning point being when the press reported that the Japanese ambassador had broken off negotiations for a settlement to Japan's advancement in the Pacific, only just prior to the attack. Another horrifying story was of the telegram warning of the imminent attack being delayed by decryption and typing troubles. The young cycle messenger who delivered it arrived at Hawaii several hours after the attack ended. In the short term, the Japanese had secured a successful and damaging victory over their foes by crippling the Pacific Fleet. It allowed them unhindered passage into outlying territory and increased their stranglehold on the Pacific theatre of war. In the long term, it gave America the chance to rebuild a bigger and better fleet. The Japanese had failed to take out the oil storage reserves and shore facilities, which would have really handicapped America, and it gave the Allies a new and powerful force to step into battle with. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the most beloved presidents of America, announced that the day of the Pearl Harbor strike was a date which will live in infamy. Within an hour of the attack, U.S. Congress declared war on Japan, and the President signed the declaration on December 8, 1941. For no apparent reason, and in hindsight, this became another turning point in the downfall of Hitler and his German army. Germany and Italy declared war on America a mere 3 days later. This confounded and outraged the American people, who were fully behind President Roosevelt's plan of action to step up support to the ailing United Kingdom's fight for freedom. America, the sleeping giant, had awoken, and she was angry. In fact, it wasn't long before the American Navy gained the upper hand in the Pacific theatre of war. In 1942, with the Japanese thinking they had cornered the American fleet into a trap, they hoped to finish off the remaining battleships and invade Hawaii. What they didn't account for was the Americans' resilience and resourcefulness, which led to a narrow defeat for the Japanese. In trying to capture the Midway Atoll Island, a tiny uninhabited American island situated halfway between Honolulu in Hawaii and Tokyo in Japan, the Japanese were planning to invade the western coast of America. This, they assumed, would lead to a withdrawal of troops from Europe and a victory for Germany and Japan. However, the Japanese were outthought and outmaneuvered by American ships and planes, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz. Like D-Day would be a turning point for the European theatre of war in 1944, the Battle of Midway was a crucial turning point for the Pacific theatre of war 2 years earlier. To boost public morale, footage was often shown of famous Hollywood celebrities signing up to help the American army. One of the most celebrated of these was the classic everyman hero of the silver screen, James Stewart. Jimmy, as he liked to be known, was already a qualified pilot when he signed up for the US Army Air Force a year before Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was initially rejected for being too skinny, but he gained weight and successfully reapplied. Although many famous celebrities signed up to fight, most of them were kept out of reach of any real combat. They were more likely to be used for the purposes of publicity than flying bombing raids over Germany. Jimmy Stewart objected to this special treatment, requesting the same combat duty as other pilots. By the end of the war, he had flown 20 missions over Europe with the 8th Air Force, piloting a B-24 Liberator. When America launched into a declaration of war, it was inevitable that the increasing demands on manpower during an ever-escalating war would leave a shortage elsewhere. The role of the women of America became crucial to the outcome of America's victory in this fight against oppression. To begin with, the Army alone took away over 50 million able-bodied men to train and fight overseas. Even before America joined the Allied forces, they were producing machines and ammunition for their friends across the sea. The production line effectively trebled when they entered the Second World War. Using what can only be described as a mild form of emotional blackmail, women were recruited into the factories and industries of war-making by eye-catching posters with catchphrases such as, "Women in the war, we can't win without them," "Do the job he left behind," and "Victory is in your hands." The women that left their homes to work were referred to by the nickname Rosie the Riveter. This image was taken from one particular poster, showing a drawing of a strong, competent, independent woman, dressed in working overalls and with her hair tied up in a bandana. She is showing off her muscles and looking for all the world like a female bodybuilder. This patriotic symbol of womanhood showed the female population that they too could be a Rosie the Riveter if they signed up to join the war effort in the factories today. But, as with any recruitment policy, the hand that was reaching out sometimes didn't like reaching out far enough. Women of all ages turned out to help with the American war effort, only to find themselves sometimes discriminated against when they applied for the jobs offered, even though most of the jobs didn't require any sort of basic training or knowledge of the workplace. The odd employer would only allow a low quota of women workers in the factories, or wouldn't allow them to take on the roles that the men had previously filled. This attitude came from the chauvinistic view that men were the sole breadwinners in the family, and a woman's job was to stay in the kitchen and look after the home. Again, mixed signals came from the government when Paul McNutt, the chairman of the War Manpower Commission, issued a 1942 directive stating that No women responsible for the care of young children should be encouraged or compelled to seek employment which deprives their children of essential care until all other sources of supply are exhausted. But World War II became something of a symbol of freedom for the women in America. It allowed them to leave behind their stereotypical roles and prove that they could do men's work as well as any man. It changed their traditional roles as they volunteered for factory jobs in such diverse areas as welding, machining, building aircraft, fixing tanks, and manning armament factories. These were all jobs that the men who had been called away to war would normally be doing. Over 6 million women took over in these fields, and it became something of an emblem for a changing face of womanhood. Of course, American women were not only invaluable on the home front, but also in the front line too. They appeared as nurses and doctors, often in the firing line of the enemy. The Women's Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs for short, also played a crucial role in flying and testing the B-29 bomber, which would be used to end the war with Japan. America's women worked alongside Americans' men to fight for truth, justice, and the American way of life. Meanwhile, whilst the Pacific battle was raging after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt continued to send men and machinery to the United Kingdom, which generated more jobs for women back home. All of this manpower and military arsenal was in preparation for an assault on occupied France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the American president and his trusted Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall drew up a plan to take on the might of the Germans in a frontal attack. Jimmy Stewart would join thousands of other American Air Force and Army soldiers when he was stationed in England during the build-up to Operation Overlord, or D-Day as it was better known. He arrived there as commanding officer of the 703rd Bomb Squadron. Equipped with B-24s and subsequently attained the rank of Chief of Staff of the 2nd Combat Wing, 2nd Air Division of the 8th Air Force, flying many missions over occupied Europe and taking an active part in D-Day. In 1943, President Roosevelt chaired an historic meeting between the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, the tenacious and determined Winston Churchill, and the USSR's proud and opinionated Premier, Joseph Stalin. This would be known as the Tehran Conference, which took place in Iran, and whilst there they would outline what would become the last stages of the Second World War. A declaration was signed on the 1st of December, which read, "We, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the Premier of the Soviet Union have met these 4 days past in this, the capital of our ally Iran, and have shaped and confirmed our common policy." The major talking point was the status of Operation Overlord. The USSR had fought off the might of Adolf Hitler's German army, which, like Napoleon Bonaparte's French army of 1812, had assumed a quick victory would be at hand, and failed to negotiate the long cold winter months that befell the barren stretches of the USSR. But Stalin was fearful that a second attack during the summer months would overthrow Moscow. He urged the American President and the British Prime Minister that they should start an offensive in the West to take the pressure off his country. President Roosevelt agreed and outlined Operation Overlord, but Winston Churchill was hesitant because of the recent losses the Allies had suffered in North Africa. On returning from the conference, Operation Overlord officially began. The plan was to create a huge army of American, Canadian and British soldiers to cross the English Channel and invade German-occupied France. It was audacious and bold. Such an invasion force had failed to navigate the rough seas between the United Kingdom and France since William the Conqueror had invaded and taken the crown of England in 1066. Immediately, American infantry was sent to the United Kingdom via planes and boats. The war in the Pacific Ocean led to many difficulties in getting supplies and machinery through to England, and in some cases the Americans flew via Greenland and Scotland to reach there. Operation Overlord was directed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been the protege of America's Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. General Marshall had wanted to oversee this invasion force himself, but President Roosevelt had insisted that he should stay in America and control the war in the Pacific. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was a well-respected and likable man who never quite saw eye to eye with the head of the British invasion force, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery. Whereas Ike, as Eisenhower liked to be called, was ready with a quick wit and an ability to pitch in with everyday soldiers, Monty, as Montgomery was christened, had an aloof resolve and a disdain for rank or privilege. Eisenhower led with words of encouragement, and Montgomery led with strict discipline. With the huge influx of American soldiers arriving in Britain, the popular phrase that circulated the United Kingdom was that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Of course, it wasn't long before the cheeky US soldiers reversed the phrase for their British counterparts as underpaid, undersexed, and under Monty. In the lead-up to the invasion of France, the American and the British both conducted separate bombing raids on strategic points in France and Germany. The Americans threw caution to the wind and decided that their planes were superior enough to conduct daylight bombing raids. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and the B-24 Liberators flew deeper and deeper into Germany, hitting many significant targets of industry and communications. The British Lancasters and Halifaxes were too big and unwieldy to operate in daylight, so their raids were carried out under the cover of darkness. The German army, suspecting an invasion of France, had the wrong idea about where it would be carried out. The easiest place for an invasion force to cross was from Dover in England to Calais in France, because there was only a 20-mile gap between them. Allied forces, after months of reconnaissance, decided that the beaches of Normandy would be a better bet. With this in mind, they set about creating a false invasion squadron based in Dover. D-Day, or Debarkation Day to give it the full name, was scheduled for June the 5th, but the weather was extremely bad, and so the invasion of Normandy was postponed for 24 hours. Eisenhower gave the orders for the invasion to begin on June the 6th, 1944. Still, the weather and visibility were poor, and the moon was no longer full enough to light the way clearly, but this paid dividends for the Allied forces as they swept in almost invisible to the Germans who manned the Atlantic Wall, which was a huge long trench that stretched the length and breadth of the French coast. Each of the Normandy beaches that were to be invaded were given a name. The Americans were to land on Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. The British had Gold and Sword Beach to liberate, whilst the Canadians were to land on Juno Beach. The German defences were spread thinly across the Atlantic Wall, as they didn't have a clue as to where the attack was going to happen. They were trying to defend everything and, in a sense, ended up defending nothing at all. So bad was the weather during June that the leader of the German coastal defences of France, General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, expected nothing to happen at all. So confident was he of a lack of invasion that he returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday. Due to the poor visibility and the strong undercurrent that ran through the waters of the English Channel, all the ships full of landing party troops were pulled off course. For some, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise. For others, it wasn't such a lucky occurrence. After much fighting, Juno Beach was taken by the Canadians. Even though they were supported by an artillery of firepower from destroyers out at sea and airplanes overhead, the first advancing wave still lost a horrific 50% of their soldiers. In contrast, Gold Beach and Sword Beach were captured with relative ease by the British Army. This was due to the lack of German troops guarding them and the swiftness of the attack. The American infantry, who arrived at Utah Beach, did so at completely the wrong place, through no fault of their own. Due to the heavy undercurrents of the sea, the first wave of the American invasion force ended up 2,000 yards away from their planned landing spot. This could have proved costly, as they had strict objectives to follow and a well-planned outroute to take. However, confusion was diverted by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., eldest son of the 26th President of America and distant cousin to the serving President Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, when he took charge of the company. The casualty rate was very low. Only 197 men were lost. 60 of those were at sea on the initial voyage in, and Utah Beach became a triumph for Brigadier General Roosevelt and the American infantry. By the end of the day, a total of 20,000 troops and over 1,700 vehicles had reached Utah Beach. In comparison, the Omaha Beach landings by the American infantry were a bloody massacre. Most of the soldiers stationed on the Atlantic Wall to secure the coastline of France from impending invasion had been made up of part German soldiers who'd never seen much action and part prisoners of war from Russia and Poland. Unfortunately, at the section defending Omaha Beach, the part-timers had just been replaced by the battle-hungry and military-trained German 352nd Division, who would stop at nothing to fortify their positions. The beach sloped downwards, making an invasion force easy targets to pick off with machine guns, and much of the lower area near the sea was mined. With probably only 100 or so German soldiers hidden away in virtually impenetrable positions on the Atlantic Wall, they managed to kill over 4,000 American soldiers before they were overrun. Survivors from that day can recall the heavy avalanche of bullets ricocheting off the landing ramps of the crafts they were in. When the ramps were dropped, the water in front of them came alive with fountains of white spray as bullets hailed down into the sea. Even if they survived wading slowly through 200 yards of rough water to the beach, there was no shelter from the enemy fire until further up. Soldiers were falling to the ground, left, right and centre, like some bizarre and deadly game of dominoes. Despite the huge loss of life and equipment, the American troops didn't give up. Leadership by officers and non-commissioned soldiers inspired others to join them, and the Americans' never-say-die attitude seeped through to even the walking wounded. One of the main objectives of this first wave of American troops was to capture Pointe du Hoc. This was a towering cliff that jutted out towards both Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, housing huge artillery machine guns on top of it. It was the perfect vantage point for picking off men and machines on both of the American invasion beaches. Against heavy fire and explosions, Lieutenant Colonel James D. Rudder, a former Texas football coach, and his small band of 200 men scaled the 100-foot sheer cliff face to knock out the 5 large guns. Upon reaching the top, they found that the guns had been moved to a safer position, away from aircraft firepower, and were surrounded by crates of ammunition. The Rangers destroyed it all, and to this day there is a memorial to this extraordinary feat of daring at Pointe du Hoc, and the cliff itself, including the bomb-cratered surrounding area, is untouched since 1944. Looked at today, Omaha Beach appears calm, peaceful and tranquil. It is hard to believe that such a huge loss of life ebbed away like the tide on this sandy coastline. Situated near the Omaha Beach are rows and rows of white marble headstones, some bearing the Star of David and some bearing a simple Latin cross. It is the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, situated on donated land by the people of France. It is a humbling and haunting place that goes some way to show the incredible loss of life on June the 6th, 1944. From the landings on D-Day, the Allied forces regrouped beyond the beaches and slowly advanced through France. Because of the dense 3-foot-high hedgerows, it was difficult to get anywhere at speed, as they were excellent defensive standpoints for the Germans. But eventually, after June became July, and July became August, word got to the citizens of Paris that they were to be liberated, and they took up arms to overthrow their German oppressors, just as the American forces entered Paris to liberate it. The Red Army of the USSR had repelled Germany's second attack too, because of the sudden transfer of troops to try and deal with the D-Day invasions and the slow advance on Paris, France. In December of 1944, Hitler counterattacked with what was to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, so called because it created a bulge in the advancing line of American and British troops. Hitler's German army tried to split the American and British forces in two, killing over 70,000 American troops and just 1,500 British troops by pushing through where he felt the line was at its weakest. He mistakenly believed that the Americans were not as well trained as the British. The Allied forces fought off Hitler's German army and asked for help from the USSR, who continued advancing towards Germany. The most callous killings in this battle were at Malmedy in Belgium, where an American infantry division surrendered to a German SS Panzer army of tanks. The unarmed American soldiers were stood in a field and shot one by one. During the fight on the Eastern Front, America had also been fending off Japan in the Pacific. Two separate American fleets from North and the South formed a kind of pincer movement, eventually culminating in heavy warfare with Japanese ships and planes nearly every day. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides, and America was keen to end this violent conflict. The USSR's Joseph Stalin again met up with America's President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, this time at Yalta in the Ukraine. The Yalta Declaration came from this conference and declared that the Allies would destroy German militarism and Nazism, and to ensure that Germany will never again be able to disturb the peace of the world, and to exact reparation in kind for the destruction wrought by the Germans. At Yalta, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months after the German surrender, in return for territorial concessions in the Far East. The troops of the USSR finally marched into Berlin, Germany, to take over the last remnants of Nazi occupation, and on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, hidden away in his underground bunker with close friends and associates, committed suicide. The surrender of Germany was complete, as Hitler's newly appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz signed the documents at Eisenhower's headquarters in Rheims on May the 7th. The following day was pronounced VE Day by the American and British governments, which stood for Victory in Europe Day. Sadly, barely a month before peace in Europe reigned, America's President Franklin D. Roosevelt had passed away after a long bout of ill health. VE Day was dedicated to him and his passion for peace in the world. His vice president, who had only served 82 days in office as Roosevelt was re-elected, was Harry S. Truman, and he had to step up to fill the late president's shoes just at the time when Japan weren't looking to surrender like Germany before them. Japan continued to defy America, even though their navy had been reduced to ineffectiveness by the superior tactics of the American fleet. The Japanese army was still holding strong in China and the home islands, preferring to use kamikaze attacks on the Americans rather than meeting them in fair combat. Suicide attack squads would just dive bomb their planes into American ships during the battle for the Philippines, sinking a total of 17 aircraft carriers that way. America feared, that to attack overland, where Japan's army was still in full glory, would cost at least another 1 million lives. Throughout the war, the American and the British government, suspiciously believing that Germany was doing the same, had funded the development of an atomic bomb. The first one was tested in New Mexico early in 1945. 2 more were built, and the new president made the unenviable decision of using these newly invented atomic bombs on the Japanese, rather than sacrifice so many of his fellow countrymen. The atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and President Truman hoped that the fear and destruction it caused would give Japan the incentive to surrender. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, the American B-29 bomber plane called Enola Gay dropped the bomb onto the central part of Hiroshima. It killed an estimated 80,000 civilians outright. The day after that, August the 8th, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese Manchuria in order to speed up the surrender. And on August the 9th, America dropped the second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, which killed an estimated 40,000 people. 6 days later, still reeling from the huge devastation, the Japanese surrendered and signed an unconditional declaration aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. VG Day, which stood for Victory in Japan Day, was celebrated a little later than that, on September 2nd, 1945. In the aftermath of World War II, the 3 superpowers, now represented by America's new President Harry S. Truman, Britain's new Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and the old USSR faithful Premier Joseph Stalin, came together again to design the future of their alliance and the state of the New World Order. They planned the upcoming Nuremberg trials for crimes against humanity, in order to punish the Germans for the atrocities they'd perpetrated during the war. An American creation was set in motion for the purpose of world peace. This would be called the United Nations Organization. In September 1945, leaders from over 40 different countries met in San Francisco, California, to sign the United Nations Charter. The United States of America could proudly fly the flag of victory and freedom. American men on the front line and American women on the home front would forever be changed by this experience. The Statue of Liberty stands tall and proud in New York Harbor, and she says to her returning sons and daughters of war, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door."